Good Tuesday morning, sisters and brothers. Welcome to another edition of our Tuesday Tune-Up. This morning, I want to talk about one of our very familiar parables. Jesus taught a lot in parables. This one is the prodigal son. There are few that are as well known as this story. In fact, it's been called the world's best known short story. It's only 3 paragraphs long, and yet Jesus does a lot in those 3 paragraphs to teach us about ourselves, about our place in the world, and our relationship with God. Let me give you this parable so that we can discuss it. This is from the 15th chapter of Luke. Then Jesus said, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me.' So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the young son gathered all he had, traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout the country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough to spare, and here I am dying of hunger? I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of the hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his fingers and sandals on his feet, and get the fatted calf and kill it. And let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his elder son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. He replied, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has got him back safe and sound.' Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him, but he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I've never disobeyed your command, yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, who had devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him.' Then the father said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found.'" Wow. Jesus is the greatest storyteller of all time. There's a lot to discuss in this parable. I think we should probably, though, start with the name. Jesus never calls this the parable of the prodigal son. That name comes from later historians, but I would argue it's somewhat of a misnomer. For the story isn't really about the son, as the son isn't the main character. Now, that may seem a small thing, but think for a minute of how your appreciation for the story would have been changed if J.K. Rowling had called the book Ron Weasley and the Sorcerer's Stone. Now, that wouldn't have made sense, as the main character is really Harry Potter. So in the same way, the main character in this parable really isn't the Son, it's the Father. In actuality, it should be called the parable of the forgiving Father. Be that as it may, the Son asks the Father to give him his share of the inheritance, and this is in keeping with the Jewish law of the time, where the sons each inherit from the Father. The oldest gets the lion's share, but the other son gets something. It's up to the Father to decide, though, whether or not he will honor this request. Now, he can say, no, I'm not going to give you the inheritance till I die. But in the parable of the forgiving Father, he decides to give him what he asks, even though he runs the risk of seeing his son squander it. It seems to me that this is not unlike God's gift to us of free will. God has the ability to command us, but instead loves us so much that he gives us the ability to choose for ourselves, even when he knows that we may squander that blessing. Well, predictably, the son does indeed squander all that he has. The money his father has worked a lifetime to build is gone. We might say today that he made poor life choices. Yes, I just used air quotes. He's left broke, homeless, and hungry, and so he takes the only job he can find, feeding the pigs of a Gentile farmer. Now, that may not seem like much to us, but to the Pharisees that Jesus was addressing, this was about the worst thing that anyone could do. Working for a Gentile was something that no Jew would ever do if they could avoid it. And to make matters worse, he was forced to care for pigs. Pigs were considered unclean, and any Jew that came into contact with one was considered defiled and tainted. To have sunk so low was unthinkable for the Pharisees and the scribes, but it made Jesus' point very clear. And then Jesus pays humanity what I think is one of the best compliments ever. Jesus says, "But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's servants,'" etc., etc., etc. When he came to himself. Wow. What Jesus is saying here is that the Son had it in him all along to know right from wrong. He and, well, all of us have an innate understanding of right and wrong, and it is this gift that Jesus refers to when he says, when he came to himself. For that prodigal son, once he had hit rock bottom, he was finally able to tap into his own self, into his own heart, and know what he must do. This, my friends, is repentance. Repentance is not simply wearing black or giving up candy or Facebook for Lent. No, we often misunderstand the concept of repentance. A good translation from the original Greek is something like thinking differently after. That's what the Son does here. He's been through his dark time, and now that he has, as Jesus put it, come to himself, he thinks differently afterward. He decides to go home and beg his father to treat him as one of the hired hands. Now, this too is significant. There was a hierarchy to the structure of a household in that day. The father was the head of the house, and the sons were next. Then came the women of the family. Sorry, ladies, I didn't make it up. Followed by the house slaves, who were treated almost as part of the family. And then finally, at the lowest possible level, were the hired hands. Now, they were thought of as outsiders, and they really had no status at all. They were fed and paid for their work, but they could be dismissed on a whim, and they had no role in the life of the family. And it is this status that the prodigal son is seeking. And he plans to beg his father to treat him like that. Think of how low that makes him and how far he has fallen. Jesus continues, "But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him." Let's pause here for a moment. Thus far, we've been talking mostly about the prodigal son, but remember that I said this story should really be called the parable of the forgiving father. Think about what the father must have been feeling. He decided to do as his son asked, sold off part of his estate, gave the money to his son, and his son promptly disappeared. He could have said no to the son's request and kept him at home for his own good. But he gave the Son the chance to experience free will, and now that the Son is gone, he doesn't know if he's even alive or dead. Yet rather than be angry, the Father is worried and spends his time waiting for any news and watching for his Son's return. And then he sees him coming. He had been watching. And it would be all too tempting for the Father, I would think, to wait for the Son to come to him. After all, it's the Son who was in the wrong, and the Father really had every right to await the apology that he most certainly deserved. But that's not what happened. Instead, the Father runs to him and is overjoyed to see him. The Son begins his apology, but the Father never even lets him finish. He didn't get a chance to be asked to be treated as one of the hired hands when the Father, in his joy, calls for a robe and a ring and sandals. And then he calls for a celebration. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. For the Father, all that happened before is in the past. He has completely and totally forgiven the Son. This isn't conditional, and it's not forgive but not forget. It's total and absolute forgiveness that treats the Son as if nothing had ever happened. That is an incredibly high standard, but it's also in keeping with the Father's nature. And so everything is now wonderful, right? Well, not quite, except we've not yet met the third character in the story, the older son. Before we get to his appearance, though, think about what's happened. His younger brother has asked for and gotten his inheritance. No more, but no less. And this impacts the older brother not one little bit. He still has what's coming to him, and his inheritance is in fact secure. He may be upset at the way the younger brother has treated their father, but aside from that, it really doesn't affect him at all. And yet, when he hears that his brother has come home, he gets angry, and he won't even go into the house. Rather than be pleased that his only brother has come home, he gets upset and angry, and is really angry that the father has chosen to forgive him. The elder son seems to want to see the younger one punished for his transgressions, and is upset that the father's not going to make that happen. You can almost just hear him righteously proclaiming something, "It's not fair. Justice must be served." This is a distinct shot at the Pharisees for being intolerant. But more than that, it speaks to each of us as a warning. It echoes another of Jesus' sayings, "For the last shall be first, and the first shall be last." Well, we could go on for hours on this particular parable, but let's bring this plane in for a landing. We have three distinct characters, three different personalities in this story. So my question for you, sisters and brothers, is this: with which do you most identify? Are you most like the prodigal son who had human weakness, but also learned the concept of repentance? Are you the elder son who was diligent and hardworking, but was also self-absorbed and lacking in forgiveness? Or are you like the father who loved so much that he was willing to let the son make his own mistakes and then practiced total forgiveness and joy at his return? No judgment, friends, but this is a great mirror to hold up with which to see ourselves. Ponder this as the week goes on. God bless you. God love you. We'll see you next week.